The door didn't slam. That's what I keep coming back to, even now. It would have been easier if it had slammed some dramatic punctuation to mark the end of something. Instead, my father simply closed it. Quietly. The way you close a door on a room you've decided to stop using. I stood on the front porch of the house I grew up in with a duffel bag at my feet and a light jacket that wasn't doing much against a March night in Ontario, and I thought, this is actually happening. 3 hours earlier, I had been sitting at the kitchen table, telling my parents I was pregnant. 11 weeks. The father was my ex-boyfriend of 2 years, a man they had met exactly 4 times, and smiled through each time, the polite, tight smiles of people tolerating something they'd decided they didn't like. We had broken up 6 weeks before I found out. He hadn't returned a single message since. My mother had gone very still, in the way she does, when she is deciding something. My father had pushed back his chair, and walked to the window, and stood there with his back to me for a long time. When he turned around, his face had already made its decision. He told me I had brought shame on the family. He told me this was not how he had raised me. He told me that if I was going to make this choice, he said this choice, as though the pregnancy itself were something I'd selected from a menu, then I would be making it somewhere else. I asked my mother to say something. She looked at the table. I was 26 years old. I had a job I loved, third-grade teacher at a public school in Mississauga. I had been living at home for the last 4 months, not because I couldn't manage on my own, but because my lease had ended in November, and I'd been saving for a down payment. I had looked at a condo in Port Credit in January. I had a spreadsheet. I had a plan. None of that seemed to matter to anyone in that kitchen. I took what I could fit in one bag. I left everything else, the boxes still stacked in the corner of my childhood bedroom, the winter boots in the front closet, the framed photo of my grandmother on my nightstand. I told myself I would come back for all of it. I wasn't sure I believed that. My sister called me before I even made it to my car. I don't know how she found out so fast. She lived 40 minutes away in Hamilton with her husband and their 7-year-old, and somehow she already knew, the way she has always somehow already known things about me. She said, "Where are you right now?" I said, "Standing in the driveway." She said, "Get in the car. Drive here. Don't stop anywhere." That was it. No questions. No hesitation. No "are you sure?" or "let me think about this," or any of the negotiation I had been bracing for. Just come here. And I did. My sister had converted their spare room into a home office after their daughter outgrew it. There was a desk, a futon, stacks of her husband's architectural drawings rolled up against one wall. By the time I arrived, she had already moved the desk to the corner and put clean sheets on the futon and set a glass of water on the windowsill like it was a proper guest room. I stood in the doorway, and she stood behind me, and she said, quietly, that I could stay as long as I needed. Her husband, standing a few feet back in the hallway, nodded once in that steady way he has, and went to make tea. I slept in that room for the rest of my pregnancy. My sister is 3 years older than me. She has always been the practical one, the one who reads the fine print, who arrives early, who keeps her receipts. She is not a demonstrative person. She doesn't cry at movies. She once told me that she expresses love through logistics, which sounds like a joke, but isn't entirely. After I moved in, she started leaving little notes on the kitchen counter. "Your prenatal appointment is Tuesday at 10. I rescheduled my meeting, or there's soup in the fridge. Please actually eat it." She drove me to every appointment for the first 3 months. She sat in waiting rooms, reading whatever she'd brought, and never made me feel like any of it was an inconvenience. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. My sister did not do any of this effortlessly. She and her husband were not in a position where having a pregnant sister-in-law appear indefinitely was a simple or cost-free thing. They were saving for a renovation. Her husband's firm had gone through layoffs that winter, and he was freelancing to cover the difference. Their daughter had a room 3 feet away from mine, and had nightmares some nights, and occasionally woke the whole house up at 2 in the morning. None of that stopped either of them from making space. I found out at 16 weeks that I was having a girl. My ex still hadn't responded to any of my messages. I had sent him 4 texts and 1 long email, not begging, not angry, just factual, and received nothing back. A colleague at work told me she'd seen him at a Raptors game the week before, and that he looked fine. That information was not useful to me in any practical way, but I thought about it more than I should have. I worked until the last possible week before my due date. I had to. The financial picture was genuinely frightening. My school board sick leave covered the first 2 weeks, and then I'd be on employment insurance, 55% of my insurable earnings, for up to 18 months between maternity and parental leave combined. It sounds like a lot until you're trying to do the math on it. My sister never once mentioned money, never handed me a bill, never looked at me any particular way when I used the grocery store card she'd added me to. But I was aware. I was always aware. My daughter was born in September. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She came out with her eyes wide open, which the nurse said was unusual, and she looked around the room with such a focused, assessing expression that my sister, who was holding my hand, laughed out loud, and said she looked like she was already taking inventory. We brought her home to the room in Hamilton that I had slowly, over the months, made less like a home office, and more like somewhere a baby could live. My sister had found a crib second-hand and sanded it and repainted it white. Her husband had installed a small shelf above the change table without being asked. My parents did not come to the hospital. My sister had, at some point in the weeks before, told my mother when the due date was. My mother had not responded. My father had said, through my mother, that they wished me well, but that they stood by what they had said. I had not spoken to either of them directly since the night I left. The first few months were brutal in the way that first months always are, and also in some additional ways that I hadn't anticipated. I was sleep-deprived in a way that felt clinical. I was grieving something I couldn't quite name, not just my parents, but the version of my life I'd had mapped out, the condo spreadsheet, the plan. I was doing it all, without the person who was supposed to be doing it with me. And while I had chosen to continue the pregnancy, and I did not regret my daughter for a single second, the absence of her father was something I felt daily, like a pressure behind the sternum. He contacted me when she was 8 weeks old. I almost didn't open the message. I saw his name, and I sat with my phone face down on the table for 20 minutes before I could make myself read it. He said he'd heard she had been born. He said he thought they should talk. He said, and this is the part I have read back so many times, since that he was open to being involved, depending on how things were structured. Depending on how things were structured, as though my daughter were a business arrangement he might be willing to enter, pending review of the terms. I called a family lawyer the next day. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. My sister got more of that than I did. But I knew, sitting there with my 8-week-old in the bouncer beside me, and that message still open on my phone, that I needed someone in my corner who spoke a language he would understand. The lawyer was a woman about 10 years older than me, with an office near downtown Hamilton and the kind of direct, unhurried manner that immediately made me feel like I was not in this alone. She walked me through the process, without making it more complicated than it needed to be. In Ontario, she said, child support is calculated based on the federal child support guidelines. It's tied to income, it's enforceable through the Family Responsibility Office, and it is not optional. She also told me that if he had been voluntarily absent since the pregnancy, which he had been, in writing that would be taken into account. He did not make the process easy. He hired his own lawyer. He questioned the paternity, which required a DNA test that confirmed what I had already known. He submitted paperwork late, twice. His lawyer sent letters with language designed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable for pursuing what was, legally, my daughter's right. My lawyer sent back responses that were calm, thorough, and apparently effective, because after 6 months of back and forth, a settlement was reached. He owed retroactive support from the month of her birth. By the time the order came through, that amounted to just over $14,000 in arrears, plus ongoing monthly payments going forward. The FRO would handle collection directly from his paycheck if he missed anything. My lawyer explained it to me in her office, and I sat there and nodded, and then walked to my car in the parking garage and cried for a while, Not from sadness, exactly, just from the release of having carried something heavy for a long time and being allowed to finally set it down. I went back to work when my daughter was 11 months old. My sister had done research on daycares in the area, the way she does research on everything systematically, with notes, and had found a licensed home daycare, 3 streets away, run by a woman who had been doing it for 15 years, and had a waiting list. My sister had gotten us on that waiting list before my daughter was born. I don't know how to adequately describe what the next year felt like, so I'll just say that it felt like traction. Like wheels finding pavement after a long time spinning in mud. My daughter was walking by 13 months, saying words by 14, and by 18 months had a strong preference for dinosaurs and blueberries, and very strong objections to wearing socks. She was funny. She was relentless. She looked almost nothing like her father, and everything like my mother's side of the family. Same wide-set dark eyes, same stubborn set to her jaw when she'd decided something. I thought about my parents. I tried not to, but I did. I would catch my daughter's face at certain angles and see my mother in her, and it would put a small cold weight somewhere behind my ribs. I had not reached out to them. I had decided I would not be the one to reach out, and my sister agreed with me, and so the silence continued. My sister did speak to my mother occasionally. She didn't tell me everything that was said, but she told me enough. My parents knew my daughter existed. They knew her name. They had not asked to meet her. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until much later, was that my ex had been in contact with my parents at some point during that first year. I don't know exactly when, and I don't know exactly what he said. What I know is what my mother eventually told me. That he had told them he had serious doubts about whether he was my daughter's father. That he had implied I had been involved with someone else during our relationship. That he had said, carefully, that he had agreed to the DNA test to protect himself, but that he had private reasons to believe it might not be reliable. He had told my parents that my daughter might not be their granddaughter. I didn't know any of this on the afternoon my daughter had just turned 3 when I was in my kitchen making her lunch and heard a knock at my front door. My sister and her family had moved to a larger house the year before, and I had finally taken over the lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Stony Creek, close enough to stay near them, private enough to feel like mine. My daughter was in the living room behind me, deeply absorbed in a puzzle involving a stegosaurus. I opened the door. My parents were standing on the other side of it. My mother was holding a stuffed rabbit, the soft, expensive kind, from the toy store in the mall, still in the bag. My father had his hands in the pockets of his coat and was standing a half step behind her, the way he does when something is her idea, and he is still deciding how fully he endorses it. I didn't say anything for a moment. I genuinely did not know what to say. 3 years is a long time. They looked older. My mother's hair had more gray in it than I remembered. My father looked like he'd lost some weight. My mother said my name. And then she said, her voice doing something uncertain that I had almost never heard from her. Can we please just see her? I stood there in the doorway for a long moment. My daughter chose that exact second to come padding into the hallway behind me in her socks, the ones with the frogs on them that she'd recently decided were acceptable, carrying half her puzzle and saying that the stegosaurus was missing a piece, and was I hiding it? I watched my parents see her for the first time. My mother made a sound I had never heard her make before. My father's hands came slowly out of his pockets, and he went very still. My daughter squinted up at them with the same focused, assessing expression she'd worn in the delivery room 3 years ago, and said, "Who are you?" My mother crouched down to her level, and her voice, when she spoke, was not entirely steady. She introduced herself as my mother. She said she had brought the rabbit. My daughter considered this information, and the rabbit for several seconds, and then asked if she could see it. Later, after I had let them come inside, not because I had forgiven anything in that moment, but because my daughter had already taken the rabbit out of the bag and named it and made the decision for all of us, my mother sat on my couch and kept looking at my daughter's face with an expression I eventually understood was recognition. My daughter had the same dark eyes as my grandmother, my mother's mother, who had passed away the year before I got pregnant. The same unusual shape to them, the same slight downward tilt at the outer corners, that everyone in my mother's family called grandmother's eyes. 3 years, and my mother was seeing her own mother's face, looking back at her from my daughter's. That was part of it. But it wasn't all of it. My father, in a very different conversation we had later, after my daughter had fallen asleep on the couch with the rabbit, and my mother had quietly covered her with the throw blanket from the armchair, told me about what my ex had said. He told me haltingly, the way my father tells things he is ashamed of. He told me that they had believed it, or that they had allowed themselves to believe it, which he said, looking at the floor, was not the same thing, but wasn't much better. He said that standing in my doorway and seeing my daughter's face, my grandmother's eyes, my family's jaw, my sister's exact expression, when she is thinking hard, he understood in about 3 seconds that they had been lied to, that they had chosen to believe a lie, because it was easier than believing that they had made a terrible mistake and would have to reckon with it. He didn't ask me to forgive him that night. I appreciated that more than I expected to. He just told me what had happened, and he sat with the weight of it, and he didn't try to negotiate it down to something more manageable. I did not throw my arms around them. I did not tell them everything was fine. I have watched enough people rush past the hard part of reconciliation because the alternative sitting in the room with what was actually done is too uncomfortable, and I was not willing to do that. 3 years is a long time. My daughter had turned 3 without grandparents. I had spent a Christmas morning in my sister's kitchen, grateful and loved, and quietly heartbroken. I had done every difficult thing without my mother, and some of those things had been very difficult indeed. But I also, and this took me longer to admit, I also missed them. I missed my mother's voice in the kitchen. I missed my father's habit of cutting the newspaper into specific sections and arranging them in order of what he thought I'd want to read. I missed the smell of my mother's house. I missed being someone's daughter in the full sense of it. We didn't solve anything that evening. We made a start. I told them clearly, and my sister, who I had called the moment my parents left the first time to get her on the phone before I did anything, had coached me on exactly how to say this, that whatever came next would happen on my terms and my daughter's, and that some things that had been said would require more than one conversation to address. My mother agreed. My father agreed. My daughter, who had woken up briefly, solemnly offered my father a piece of her puzzle to hold, and then took it back. The ex, my daughter's father, we handled separately. When my lawyer heard what he had done, what he had told my parents, she was very calm about it, in the way that people who are professionally calm can convey, wordlessly, that something is not going to go well for the other party. In Canada, a parent who actively attempts to alienate a child from their family, including the maternal family, and who deliberately misleads family members to accomplish this, has a problem in family court. His ongoing support order was not affected. It ran through the fro and continued regardless. But the other matter, the interference, the lies told to my parents, that had consequences in terms of how custody and access were structured going forward, and how much discretionary decision-making authority he retained. He did not end up with the arrangement he had wanted. He is in his daughter's life in a way that is proportional to the effort he has been willing to make, which has been limited but present. That is the most I can say honestly. My sister, when all of this was settling, when the legal chapter had closed, and my parents were coming to my apartment on Sunday afternoons, with increasing regularity, and my daughter had assigned everyone roles in a complicated game involving her toy animals, my sister said something to me that I have thought about since. She said she hadn't done any of it for my parents or for my ex, or even really for me. She had done it because my daughter deserved to come into the world and have someone in her corner immediately, without conditions, and my sister had decided she was going to be that person because someone needed to be. I told her that was the most her thing she had ever said. She told me she didn't know what that meant. It means I know her. It means I know that she doesn't announce herself, doesn't perform it, doesn't need it reflected back. It means she just does the thing that needs to be done, and then acts mildly exasperated when anyone makes a deal of it. Her husband is the same way. Their daughter, my niece, who is now 10, and treats my daughter like a small complicated science experiment she is responsible for, is growing up to be exactly the same way. I am raising my daughter to recognize that kind of love when she sees it, the kind that shows up without making you ask twice, the kind that doesn't keep a ledger. The stuffed rabbit my mother brought that first evening is on my daughter's bed. She named him Gerald, which I think is an excellent name for a rabbit. She still sleeps with him. My mother asked once, carefully, what she'd named it, and when I told her, my mother smiled in a way that took something tight out of her face. We are not all the way back, my parents and I. I don't think we will be, exactly. I think what we are building is something different from what existed before, and I have made a certain peace with that. Some things, once broken open, don't close back to their original shape. They close to a new one. What I know is that my daughter knows her grandparents. She knows her aunt, and her uncle, and her cousin. She knows, in the unspoken cellular way that small children know things, that she is surrounded. That is enough. That is, honestly, more than I had let myself hope for. In some of those early months, when I was feeding her at 2 a.m, in my sister's spare room, with the rolled-up architectural drawings in the corner, and the single lamp on, and the rest of the house quiet. I thought, in those moments, that I was on my own. I was wrong. I was never on my own. I just couldn't always see who was in the room.